Very much, everyone, for joining us today. For those whom I haven't met, I'm Paul Saunders, President of the Center for National Interest. We're delighted to have all of you here with us today for this debate. Should America continue to support Ukraine? This is going to be a little bit unusual for us in that most of the time we have, I would say, relatively free-flowing panel discussions. And this is going to be a very rigidly structured, disciplined debate, including like amounts of time that each person has to speak. And I will kind of give the times before each person speaks. And I guess I'll raise my hand when you have 30 seconds left. And I will be ruthless, on the clock because we have 4 people and limited time. So I hopefully will not have to be ruthless on anything else, but I will definitely be ruthless on the clock. So I will be very brief because no one is here really to listen to me. Everyone is here to listen to the debate, and I think the question is a fairly well-known one, and the reason for it is fairly obvious, because we've had a domestic political debate on this topic. So we've got 4, I think, terrific speakers with us today. I will go, actually, I'll just introduce them in alphabetical order. How's that? Starting right here in front of me with Helen Andrews, who's the print editor at the American Conservative, I think a fairly well-known publication, and author of the book Boomers, the Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered Disaster. Then next alphabetically we have Melinda Haring, who's a senior advisor at Razom for Ukraine, which I understand is North America's largest aid and advocacy organization focused on Ukraine, and also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And I understand as well a contributing editor at the National Interest. We have my colleague, Jacob Heilbrunn, who I imagine many know, editor of the National Interest. And finally, we have our former colleague at the National Interest, Curt, who's the executive director of the American. So we're very pleased to have the group here. We'll dive right in. I'm going to do the rest actually from my seat here. So we will start with opening statements. We get 3 minutes each from Melinda first, and then from Curt, and I have my stopwatch. So, all right, thank you, Melinda.
Thank you all for coming. So my side is going to argue that the United States should continue to support Ukraine. It's an obvious case. It's the clearest moral issue of our day. I'm joined, my worthy opponents are both from the conservative side of the field, so I'm going to give them an argument that hopefully will resonate with them. There is no greater country that represents the manly values of conservatism, of valor, heroism, courage, steadfastness, patriotism. It doesn't get more conservative than Ukraine. Let's fast forward back, or let's rewind back to February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky walked outside of the presidential compound on his phone, surrounded by a few of his advisors, and he told the world, "Ya tut." He said, "I am here. My prime minister is here. My defense minister is here, and we are going to stay." It electrified the world, and it continues to electrify the world. I challenge you to find a country that represents conservative values more than Ukraine. So Ukraine is 5,000 miles away. It is a non-NATO country, and it's not even a U.S. ally. You will hear from my opponents that this war is not winnable, that it costs too much, and it's immoral, that we're somehow using Ukrainians for our nefarious purposes. These are nonsense arguments, and we will take them apart point by point in the body of this argument. The case that Jacob and I will make is that supporting Ukraine, not at the levels that we're supporting it now, it's not enough to win the war. Let's be real. General Breedlove just came out and said, if you continue to support Ukraine at the current levels, Ukraine will lose. Let's win. The war is winnable if we declare that victory in Ukraine is our end and we give them the capabilities to do it.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, so next, Curt, you get 3 minutes.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for the center. It wasn't my first job, but it was very much where I felt that I got my start. And I also think it's important to recognize the 23rd anniversary of the 9/11 attacks and the various wars that were then fought in the victims' names. I'm sure everybody here is waiting for November, and I am as well, as I do every year when we mark Armistice Day, the memory of the end of World War I. The conservative estimates of the deaths in this war, 31,000 per Kiev's own estimates this spring. Independent investigations have put the Russian toll as high as 120,000. Our intelligence agencies put total casualties at 500,000 last year. Nobody knows. Nobody may ever know. The question before us here, I think, is very interesting. Should America continue to support Ukraine? If America pulls its current level of support, this does not preclude European support. Continue is not about litigating the decisions that were made the last 2.5 years. Support, apparently our opponents are going to argue for escalation, which is news to me, but we will hear that argument, is current levels of support as opposed to working toward a ceasefire. And Ukraine defined as the, in my opinion, as the territory currently under the government of Vladimir Zelensky, who has conveniently suspended elections. I am, and my partner here are going to urge us to reject this resolution, and you will hear why. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. Both very disciplined on the clock. Okay, so now we're going to hear the case why the United States should support Ukraine. We get 5 minutes on that topic from Melinda, and we get a 2-minute rebuttal from Helen. So we will start
On your mark?
right
Okay.
Go.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, Ukraine must win, Russia must lose, and the United States must continue to support Ukraine. Without American support, Ukraine cannot win. Now, this is a big discussion. We saw this on Tuesday night. Why should America continue to support Ukraine? I see at least 6 reasons, and there's definitely more. First, and perhaps the most winning argument that I can make at the Center for National Interest, an argument that might even warm the heart of Nixon, is that Ukraine's victory is in our own national interest. Donald Trump may not agree, but let's go back to U.S. diplomatic history. Peace and security in Europe have been the cornerstone of U.S. policy since World War II, and for good reason. If we abandon Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine will worsen greatly and will spill over Ukraine's borders. Second, and relatedly, it's in our interest to keep the fight contained in Ukraine. Putin's ambitions are greater than Ukraine. Just ask the Lithuanian ambassador. They are very nervous. If the war spills beyond Ukraine and draws in a NATO member, we are likely to be drawn into the war with boots on the ground. And we obviously want to avoid war at all costs. Third, don't believe Bridge Colby. Our own intelligence community assesses Russia as a greater threat to the United States now in the short term than China. The Ukrainians are doing our work for us. They're doing us a great service by weakening Moscow, our greatest threat. We owe them the best weapons, the best targeting, and energy equipment we can give them to get them through the winter. And we owe them our profound gratitude for their sacrifice. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Americans want assistance to continue. A majority of Americans say, Yes, 55% in Pew's latest polling. We are a practical but optimistic people who believe that might doesn't make right, that dictators can't rewrite international borders because they want to, and never again means something for crying out loud. Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, these are all sites of mass atrocities that we thought were behind us. They're not. If Putin wins in Ukraine and no justice is ever served, we will see more tolerance for violence and mass atrocities around the world. None of us want to live in that world, and none of us want to leave that world to our children. Fifth, if Ukraine loses, America's ability to project power sinks precipitously. We're going to be a middling regional power. We're going to be like Mexico that overpromised. How many times has Joe Biden said that we are with Ukraine for however it takes? Who will take the U.S. seriously as a partner, an ally, or a friend if we don't fulfill what we started? Sixth, Ukraine can win if the West arms Ukraine to the teeth. Russia has more men, yes, to conscript and a larger economy, but the Ukrainians still have the will to fight. Let's look to what some of our retired generals are saying. Both former Sakir Breedlove and Hodges, they're serious 3- and 4-star generals. They assess that Ukraine can win if we declare victory as our goal and we act accordingly. We're going to need the Europeans, and the Europeans have not actually put the production cycles in they haven't sped them up enough, but we can do this. In conclusion, supporting a country 5,000 miles away is firmly in U.S. national interest. Not only should we continue to support Ukraine, but the next administration should declare victory in Ukraine its goal and provide the capabilities to make that happen.
Thank you, Melinda. Okay, now Helen.
Our opponent began her opening statement by trying to paint the Ukrainians as brave cowboys. And I appreciate her wanting to tailor her argument to her audience. It's true, I do work for a magazine with the word conservative in its name. But if I wanted to support the leader that looked best riding horseback with his shirt off, I would support Vladimir Putin. But I don't. That's not the criterion by which I decide America's foreign policy interests. Wanting to limit American support for Ukraine is not about supporting Russia or supporting Vladimir Putin. It's about caring about the interests of the United States. And if America were to do as our opponents suggest and make victory our objective in this conflict and say we will support Ukraine to the point where it can win, that would risk nuclear war. And I think risking nuclear war is not something that America can do lightly or should do. I think that Russia has certain capabilities that we have to respect and that create limits and restrictions on our ability to act, and we need to be realistic about that. So my question for our opponents, and one that I hope they will answer before our debate is finished today, is are there any limits on the risks America should take in its support for Ukraine? Is there any point beyond which we say the risks are too great? No, I don't think control of Donetsk is worth, the risk of nuclear war.
All right, thank you. Okay, now we get why the United States should not support Ukraine. So this is the opposite argument. We'll hear 5 minutes from Helen, who will continue, and then Jacob will have a 2-minute rebuttal of that. And after that, just to cue you in, so that you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, then we'll have 5 minutes of concluding statements from Jacob and then from Curt, and we'll be done. And we will welcome, kind of questions, comments from the audience. So Helen, 5 minutes, why we should not support Ukraine.
2 years ago, when the war began, there was a debate in this country on whether America should support Ukraine. And at that time, there was one side that said supporting Ukraine would be in America's national interest, and one side that said it would not. We are now 2 years later, and we're in a position to evaluate retrospectively which side's predictions have been borne out by events? Have the promises made by those who support Ukraine been fulfilled? Supporters of greater American involvement in the Ukraine war promised a few things. They said, first of all, and most appealingly, I think, to conservatives, that it would be a way to weaken Russia on the cheap. Ukrainians are volunteering to do the actual fighting and dying. If we just give them the pennies on the dollar, we can severely weaken an important global adversary. They said it was an important way to demonstrate American resolve, that America would be stronger on the world stage if we showed that we stand by our commitments, stand by our allies. We're still willing to act in the world. And third, they said that Ukraine was a free democracy on Russia's doorstep, and it was important. If it were drawn into the Russian orbit, it would regress from a democracy to an autocracy. We're the defenders of the principles of democracy in this world. We have a duty to stand by countries that share our values. Okay, so 2 years later, let's boil those promises down to 3 questions. Is Russia weaker? Is America stronger? Is Ukraine freer? No, no, no. As for is Russia weaker, there were promises that sanctions would cripple the Russian economy. In fact, they have stronger growth in the last quarter than the UK, France, or Germany. Sanctions have not been crippling. They've had much less of an effect on Russia than they did even in the last round of sanctions of 2014. Russia's economy has even arguably benefited from the war because it's provided a fillip to their manufacturing sector. Russia today is a net food exporter. We also have failed to isolate them diplomatically. Most of the global south has not followed us in trying to make Russia a pariah state. India, China both told us to go jump in a lake. And is Putin himself personally weaker? No. In fact, there's been a rally around the flag effect domestically. So those hoping for regime change in Moscow are disappointed. Is America stronger? Well, no, because as I just said, we failed to rally the world around our efforts to isolate Russia. This war has revealed some weaknesses in American arms supply chains. China has not been intimidated. I think there were some people who said we need to support Ukraine so that China will be scared off from invading Taiwan. I don't think that is the conclusion that the Chinese have drawn. And then is Ukraine freer? That's one where I think we need to base our evaluation not just since the war began, because obviously Ukraine is less free and less democratic today since the war began, but you can make some allowances for that because it's wartime. So of course you're going to do things like cancel elections and ban opposition parties and things of that nature. But I think that all of America's efforts to pull Ukraine into our orbit, maybe since the Orange Revolution, but definitely since the Maidan Revolution, have left Ukraine less democratic, less free, more corrupt. There is no case for American support for Ukraine more ludicrous than the line that you hear from people like Anne Applebaum. Than the idea that Ukraine is a shining beacon of democracy, and that's why Putin wanted to invade it, because he just couldn't stand to see a Slavic country become a flourishing democracy because it shamed him and his poor autocracy. No, that is just not accurate. Ukraine, one of the most important facts that you can know about Ukraine is that it had a smaller economy in 2013 than it did when communism fell. After the fall of communism, all the other Eastern European countries kind of got their act together. Poland's economy tripled in that same time span, but Ukraine remained mired in poverty and corruption. And that's because nobody ever really tamed Ukraine's oligarchs. Ukraine, even by the estimates of sympathetic observers like Anders Aslund, has the most, or in 2013, had the most expensive elections in the world. And in fact, one political scientist. Okay, we're done? Okay.
Sorry, time.
Okay. I admire your discipline. I respect.
That's the area where I will be realistic.
Fair enough.
Apologize. Jacob, you get 2 minutes.
Well, much as I expected, Helen has delivered a dexterous attack on support for Ukraine. I don't quite recognize the country that she's describing or the phenomenon that she depicts. For example, is the United States weaker, or should we say better off, for having supported Ukraine or not? I think the Ukraine war, among other things, exposed the weakness of the American defense industrial base, and that has had a salutary effect, not just in the weaponry that we've sent to Ukraine, but it has showed us that our own military priorities have been defective. We have set about remedying them in states like Pennsylvania, where we are now producing munitions again. So I think that's a net positive. Has the war weakened Russia? Unquestionably. The Ukrainians are now occupying a chunk of Russia itself, to the humiliation of Mr. Putin. Has the Russian military been weakened? Our intelligence services say that the Russian military has been set back by 10 years, which would hardly seem surprising, since Putin has at a minimum lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers in this senseless war that he began. So I think this war has been a net, has had salutary effects for the United States, and it is more. There is both a moral and a practical case for it.
All right,
Can I have 10 seconds of that?
there are
Would not be-
13 seconds.
I'll be fast.
Although,
Ukraine did not cancel elections,
well-
and Freedom House says that Ukraine has steadily been improving since 2014.
All right.
There's a lot of false statements in what Helen
We
said.
apparently have
Do you-
rollover
do you-
points.
Do you want to, you can take 15
In 13, in
seconds.
13.
Take 15
No,
seconds.
We'll play by the rules.
Seriously.
We'll play by the rules. We are committed to international order here.
All right, well, if you want. All right. All right, so now we get 5 minutes from Jacob, we get 5 minutes from Curt. Jacob.
Well, one of the arguments that my opponents did not make that I had anticipated, and it is frequently made by the opponents of aid to Ukraine, is that we are embarking or in danger of being enmeshed in another senseless forever war. And it's frequently argued that, this is another Afghanistan or Iraq. I actually think that this war makes sense in supporting Ukraine because it harkens back more to the 1980s when Ronald Reagan supported proxy operations. This war is in effect, and this is something my opponents have dodged so far, is in effect a proxy war against Russia and against the imperial ambitions that Putin has outlined repeatedly in his speeches, and I might add, in one of his articles, I believe, for the National Interest several years ago, which I printed. Now, I had at the time and have no inhibitions about printing a foreign leader's observations. It doesn't mean that I endorse them. But if you look at the direction that Vladimir Putin has gone, it is clearly towards a revival of Russian nationalism. He is not content with Ukraine itself. I think he would like to, he also has further territorial ambitions, at least in his mind. And Melinda is correct that if we do not stymie him in Ukraine, it will stimulate a further appetite. This is a last gasp of the kind of imperialism that we saw in Europe and that has basically been expunged from Western Europe. But for Mr. Putin has embarked upon this war. He clearly does not regard Ukraine as a legitimate country or nation, but instead one that should be a vassal, subject to Russian authority. The war is winnable. The weakest point of ours that our opponents have not brought up yet is what constitutes winning, and we can debate about that, whether it's a full restoration of Ukraine, including Crimea, or whether there is some more temporary solution available. But so I think that my opponents have also gone a little overboard in bringing up the nuclear danger. Mr. Putin has brandished the nuclear threat, but so far it's proven to be an empty one. And so I don't think that we are running a huge risk right now of engaging in a nuclear war over Ukraine and Europe. It's also the case that we have not made Ukraine a member of NATO, nor have we established a no-fly zone. If anything, the West has proceeded with extreme caution towards the Ukraine conflict. And the Biden administration has crab walked towards a more aggressive posture, which you now see with the debate over whether Ukraine should be allowed to employ American missiles to target deeper into Russia. So am I bullish on this war? It's turned into a stalemate, but I do believe, to address a final comment, that if we capitulated in Ukraine, it would certainly embolden other tyrants around the world. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jacob. Now we will go to Curt for the final 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to close by quickly responding to the points that our opponents put up and then say what I want to say at the end. So some words that I underlined very quickly throughout the course of this debate. The word "oh" was used as if the United States owes the people under the government of Ukraine anything further. If that is the case, then I would like to see either candidate use that language and try to win votes on the campaign trail this fall. Practical. I always view anybody who has to call themselves practical as a psychic tell that they're not being that. We are being accused of trying to put U.S. foreign policy on the position of Mexico or something. I will say, at least for Mexican foreign policy, they have a commitment to non-interventionism, and say what you will for the Mexican state, they're at least vaguely trying to better the lot of their own people, not people 5,000 miles away. Again, another psychic tell. We didn't even mention the distance. If they mentioned it, it's a bit of a tell that they know that this is quite far. The words "to the teeth" were used. I would just submit, even if they get what they want, which is alleged victory, which I'll get into in a second, what kind of country are we creating in Eastern Europe? I mean, there is such a thing as blowback. We have seen U.S. defense partners be heavily armed and then behave in ways not in the distant future that has become a huge problem. The Bucha massacre was mentioned. Look, we're not going to get into litigating that. We're not defenders of atrocities, but every day new disclosures of that story come out. Bucha was used, it appears, as a bit of a propaganda ploy to scuttle serious ceasefire negotiations that occurred in the spring of 2022. Victory. So the new president should try to win victory in Ukraine. I would ask, what were we doing the last 2.5 years if that's not what we're doing? And what is it? Is it regime change in Russia? When does it end? Not really clear. The current administration has overtly flirted with that, only to walk back all of that. I would also flag the apparently successful example of proxy wars in the Reagan administration. Again, with blowback, anniversary of 9/11. I think we can see the clear downstream effects of arming groups and countries that we don't understand very, very, very well. And then again, it's a little bit like the argument that they make in foreign policy, or that is often made on the campaign trail here, which is that Donald Trump is a coming fascist. He's also a buffoon. Which is it? Is the Russian state beatable and weak and decrepit, or are they going to go into Poland? And are they not going to use nukes, or are they so scary that the U.S. needs to take this as an existential threat to itself? Finally, I would flag a New York Times story today. Speaking in Washington D.C. here today, this is a den of foreign policy bigwigs. No person in this story on whether Western weapons should be used to strike deep into the heart of Russia, they didn't identify or cite a single person making the no case, other than by implication President Biden, who is still the president of the United States. If Donald Trump is elected in the fall, that will clearly be a rejection of convention and business as usual here in Washington. And if Harris is elected in the fall, I submit that is an opportunity to turn the page on a failed generation of leadership, and this being just the latest example of a process that is not working. It's a bit of like a friend having a drinking problem. Sometimes you need to hit rock bottom, and we are way close to it now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Curt. Okay, so that was a very lively exchange. I'm going to actually, I think, stand up to moderate so that I can see the room a little bit better. So we'll take questions from the audience. I will do my best to see everybody. I will also do my best to watch the clock. It's 1:15. We have 45 minutes. I don't want to keep anyone too long. And when we do the questions, let's just have one person from each side respond. I will not watch the clock for that, but I will urge everyone to be brief so that we can keep things moving. I saw Michael Bajos, I think, first.
Thank you. Ukraine has been a project of the United States. You might call it an American enterprise. It's going all the way back to 2009. And so now America owns this war. And the war has become an albatross around our neck. And in the coming months, no matter what we say here, things are going to increasingly accelerate toward Ukrainian collapse. So we have a period of a few months until the springtime of 2025. And so I feel, and I'd really like your response on this, I feel the real question is going to be, not now because we're in a rhetorical mode, in a bubble, but come the spring, the big question is going to be, how does the United States preserve its remaining authority in Europe and whatever residual authority it still maintains in the world?
And thank you. And you two kind of decide on each side who's going to respond. And I should have said when you ask your question, please identify yourself.
Oh, you did it for me.
Yeah, okay. Michael Bajos, sorry, yeah.
Okay, about half of what you said is nonsense, about half of what you said is true. So Ukraine is not on the verge of collapse. It's going to be the hardest winter that Ukraine has had. The grid is on the edge of collapse, I would give you that. But no expert, I've been to Ukraine 7 times since the war started. I spent 3 weeks in Lviv this summer, and I talked to a lot of energy experts. No one knows if the grid is going to collapse or not. It depends on what the Russians hit and how cold it is.
I wasn't talking about the grid, I was talking about the army. The
But-
army
so-
is heading toward collapse.
According to which expert?
According to all the combat soldiers I respect and intelligence officers I respect and professional people in the world of strategy, including people like John Mearsheimer and others, the overall assessment from all sides, US, many in Germany, Russia, of course, but also from within Ukraine. There's lots and lots of vocalization of how bad things are and exactly how quickly things are falling apart. You can ignore them and say they're nonsense, but that doesn't mean they're not there, and that doesn't mean it's not actually happening. We're just shutting our eyes to it.
Sir, look, let me be more specific. I spent an entire day with the 100th Brigade out in Lviv Oblast, and they're tired. They've been fighting for 2.5 years. They need to be rotated, and that's going to happen. But what about the Russian side? Is the Russian side full of vigor? No, they're emptying prisons. So you have to be honest. Both sides are weak. They've been fighting for a long time. The Ukrainians are not on the edge of collapse. Look at the public opinion polling. They want to continue to fight.
The public opinion polling is invested in the feet of young men
It
who have
absolutely
left
is
by the
not.
hundreds of thousands from Ukraine. It is also invested in the thousands and thousands, and we don't know how many, it's probably over 100,000 who have deserted or gone AWOL. And it's also shown in the fact that the attitude and morale is very much like that of the German army in October 1918 or the Army of Northern Virginia in March of 1865. The Ukrainian army on the front is outnumbered anywhere from 3 to 5 to 1 by Russia, and it is suffering. It's taking 2,000 casualties a day, and it has been for months and months. That cannot be sustained. I'm sorry.
Melinda, briefly, and then you guys, and then.
He's not
we'll-
interested
we'll
in
move
hearing my
on.
argument.
Wait.
Ukraine has independent polling agencies. Ukrainians want to continue to fight. It is up to them.
Let me just briefly say the
Well,
analogy.
Just
the
one,
ana-
Yeah,
one person.
Chuck
one
Cruz,
person,
we
just
object.
One person, one person.
Okay.
You'll have plenty of
right.
opportunities to talk.
So I think if you had, the kind of the bottom line that I took from that question is, how does this end? Does this end in total collapse for Ukraine? Hopefully it doesn't. But that reminds me that the most striking thing that Jacob said was, what does victory look like for Ukraine? Does it mean retaking Crimea? And he seemed to imply that it doesn't necessarily. That there are Ukraine supporters who would be okay with, an ultimate outcome, a negotiated outcome of this war, where, okay, yeah, Russia has Crimea now, and that's okay. And you maybe get some kind of negotiated peace with the two breakaway oblasts, and maybe Russia can keep them, maybe they stay, maybe there's a referendum, I don't know. But if that's what victory looks like, we could have had that 2 years ago and not with the hundreds of thousands of dead people. So if that was always going to be the outcome, with any war, the question, how does this end, is always the really most important one. And the whole point of our side is that if it ends with something you could have gotten in, January 2022, then what have we gained in the meantime except corpses?
Okay, let's go to Ariel. Ariel Cohen.
Ariel Cohen, the Atlantic Council. What I'm missing in this discussion is a context of the challenges U.S. is facing elsewhere in the world. We're facing challenges in the Pacific, we're facing challenges in the Middle East, and we're clearly facing a hot conflict in Europe. And if we let this conflict end in something that is interpreted by Russia, China, North Korea, Iran as yet another defeat of the United States after the horrible optics of withdrawal from Afghanistan and very inconclusive results in Iraq and all the way down the line to Korea, with one exception of Desert Storm 1. I think this will be a major encouragement for greater, more expensive, more devastating conflicts with orders of magnitude higher numbers of victims. You're so concerned about people killed in Ukraine, so am I. I have family in that part of the world, and I'm from there. So if we let Putin win, as two panelists suggest here, I think the Baltics may be next. I think the assumption in Moscow is going to be that we cannot fight anything, that whichever conflict we get involved in, there will be strong arguments for us to withdraw. And then the 800-pound gorilla, elephant, pick up your favorite animal in the room is Taiwan. The conflict in the Pacific is going to be much bigger, more expensive because of the distances, because of the cost of platforms, aircraft carriers, other naval vessels, many more aircraft, etc. And then whatever Mr. Colby is saying, we will not be able to win that one either, and that changes the global balance of power in catastrophic ways for the United States to remain a leader of what we broadly describe as a Western alliance plus Australia, Japan, Korea, etc. So let's put it in perspective, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
thank you, Ariel. We clearly have diverging views in the audience too. So I'll go to you two first. You, Curt?
Yeah.
This time?
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, so I'll quickly point out that that's not a question. And secondly, I also note that neither of us is British Colby, so. But I will respond to the spirit of the bromide. Okay, so the idea that this will encourage the axis of autocracies or whatever. All right, so Russia, they get some negotiated settlement, they get some Ukrainian territory, they seriously threatened their own government in the course of this. The Prigozhin attempt was not by, okay, was not exactly ideal for a head of state, in my opinion, and they will have lost potentially hundreds of thousands of men in the process of doing so. China, the calculus will remain the same. They are welcome to gamble on an amphibious landing of Taiwan at a time when their economy is rickety, and they will see how the U.S. responds. I'm not sure how that's changed at all, other than their partner, Russia, just had a pretty rough go of it in Ukraine. Iran, Iran can't even stop Israel from wiping out its allies at the inauguration of its new president or its former president from falling out of the sky. So I fail to see, while taking seriously Iranian attempts, how this emboldens them, quote unquote. And then I would just also point us out to probably the most recent example of where the U.S. Did the right thing, which is to finally end its escapade in Afghanistan and cede to the reality of Taliban control of Afghanistan. What happened on day one of the Taliban's control of Afghanistan? They got a nice present called ISIS-K to deal with. In terms of their allies on the more radical side of political Islam, they can't keep them safe. We wiped out Zawahiri in August of 2022 on his front porch, yards from the nerve center of the Taliban in Kabul. I fail to see how even the cause of violent Islam was furthered by U.S. withdrawal. This stuff sounds good. I know it makes people feel very hot-blooded and impassioned, but it doesn't work. It's not working. It's not popular. 70% of Americans think we're going in the wrong direction. It's time for a change. Of course, it's a cliche at this point, but it's also true.
I don't think it's accidental that the Biden administration immediately saw the imperative of helping Ukraine to defend itself, to accede to Vladimir Putin marching into Kiev would be a cataclysmic failure for U.S. foreign policy. It would have immediate implications for our alliances in NATO. It would embolden Russia. So to that extent, I think I'm diametrically opposed to what Curt is espousing. And, by the way, Donald Trump.
Madam Ambassador, did you
Okay,
have
I
a
want. Okay, maybe I want because I see that this discussion is getting into already internal U.S. politics,
Yes.
which we don't want to do,
Of course.
and we are just following that.
Pull us back for the
me,
brink.
How to say? It's very strange to see that when we talk about the U.S. role in the world, we somehow refer to internal politics. For us, I was born in the Soviet Union, in Lithuania, during the oppression. I do remember how it was in the Cold War, living under the Soviet regime and occupation, when we couldn't say what we want. We couldn't even think what we wanted. We couldn't travel. So for us then, US was the beacon of hope and freedom. My grandparents, my parents, I was with them as a small kid, listening to Voice of America in Free Europe, and hoping that one time, someday comes and we can be free. And we knew that US stands behind us. The only country, we knew the world, that they were the strongest post of the whole free world, which going for the right values and freedoms. And we do hope now, looking what's happening in the world, it looks as the history repeats itself. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, they are having agreements. They are pulling inside. What's happening in Africa? there are more Russian troops, Wagner troops in more African countries. They're fighting not only for political influence, also for minerals, for natural resources, which is so important for us. It's not only their values, but it's also economic benefits for that. And so that's why Ukraine we see, it's Ukraine, of course, it's Ukrainian people. We have so many refugees in Lithuania, Ukrainian, and we know how suffer they and do. They do want to or go back to their country, which would be free, or they do know how much they sacrifice, but they're willing to do that because they know what expects them if they lose. But we also know what we see, how they know all the bad guys are going, and Putin will not stop in Ukraine if it's wins or even if he doesn't lose. There was 2008 Georgia, 2014 Crimea, 2022 that we had Minsk agreement. We need Ronald Reagan. We need that how it was. He was not afraid to win. We do remember his word about the Iron Curtain, how it should fall. And that's, I think, we have to be strong. We should be believe. US, we do believe in the US. We see those cowboys that you mentioned. That for us was always like image. For the people who fight for their freedoms, they're free and they know who is good and who is evil. And Europe, Lithuania, we stand as well together. We do, it's even different. It was wake-up call not only for the US, for Ukraine, it was wake-up call for Europe and for many countries. We do invest in our defense, in security in Ukraine, and we will do more and more. We know it's not even enough now how it is. And then we share that with even with Colby, or that we have to do our best on this one. Maybe not to share. Then I have many discussions with Bridge. He is something that we have to be together. So we will do that and that. So that is my question. Where is the leadership of the U.S. and then please be that. So it's more this statement as well. And I don't see both sides have the arguments, and we don't say neither. We see how and strong cooperation, whatever it is, or President Trump or President Biden had excellent cooperation on both and encourage some things.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. I think that's primarily directed at you all, Helen.
Yeah,
Take it this time.
Madam Ambassador, you said that you and your family remember the old days of the Soviet Union when you couldn't say what you wanted. You never want to go back to that, and that America for you stood for the values of freedom. That's how I see my country too, which is why I feel personally ashamed that we are supporting a regime in Kiev that is trampling on freedom of religion, trampling on freedom of speech, that's not standing for the values that I think America needs to represent. Just last month, the government banned the canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which before Maidan had been the majority church. They impute to it some kind of links to Russia, but the truth is that the canonical church has supported Ukraine during the war, has sent aid to the front. There are members of the canonical church that serve in the Ukrainian army, and they're asking why, after I've shed blood for my country, is my church being banned? And you're trying to pressure me to join this ultra-nationalist heretical church that you set up 5 minutes ago. Don't do that to me. Don't make this about religion. Leave my church out of it. I think that's just a disgraceful thing for any government to do, to play around with schism and heresy. There's a good book that just came out a couple weeks ago, What Ukrainian Elections Taught Me About Democracy. It's by a Canadian, but don't hold that against it. It's a Canadian election observer who had been going to, just supervise elections in Ukraine for, I think, decades. And as I was reading the book, she had a funny observation. She said, something changed in Ukraine after Maidan. The first time I took a plane into Kiev after 2014, the pilot came on the intercom and said his usual, temperature 73 degrees, we'll be arriving whatever time, and then ended with Slava Ukraina. Everywhere there was this new nationalism, and it was kind of institutional, it was top down, it was imposed. And you see the record of, I was cut off rightly so, during my remarks, talking about the weaknesses of democracy under, a leader like Poroshenko. But it's true that you saw things like the expulsion of opposition journalists, the assassination of opposition leaders. It was not safe to be, in opposition to the Poroshenko regime during those years. So, yeah, I want my country to stand for freedom and democracy. That's not what I've seen in Kiev since our support for that country has escalated. And that's not what I want my tax dollars supporting.
Can I just, have you been there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I'm a journalist. I've been going 3 or 4 times a year since the war, and I don't know what country you're describing.
Well, cards on the table. My husband is from a Russian-speaking family, although his family hasn't been in Russia for over a century. And he was born in Australia, so I have personal connections to the Russian-speaking community in Australia and here. But of course, a lot of those community institutions are participated in by Ukrainians. So we've seen a lot of refugees since the war began. So yeah, this is something I have some familiarity.
Melinda, like you, get this done.
Yes, so I don't know the gentleman's name from this journalist, but I agree with his comment. Howard, I don't recognize the country you're describing, Helen. I've lived there. I go there 4 to 6 times a year. You have a Jewish president. Your defense minister is Muslim. Russia has been persecuting Christians in occupied Ukraine. We have tons and tons of documented evidence of this. We can bandy about stories. There are not restrictions on freedom of speech in Ukraine. So since the war started, martial law has been put in place. The church that you're talking about is part of the Russian government, which is why it's been outlawed. There's a lot of this is contested. You and I can have a complete debate about this, but the bottom line is look at Freedom House. I take Freedom House pretty seriously. They say that Ukraine's scores on democracy, on freedom of speech, have been steadily improving since 2014. And this idea that Slava Ukraina was imposed by the top is nonsense. If anything, there's been a flourishing of volunteerism since the Euromaidan, and that's the Ukraine I know and love.
Well, they're not having elections. I think that needs to be noted.
They're not having elections because
They're not having elections.
no, but
They suspended the election.
they can't.
I say they can say whatever
They-
can say whatever they want.
Can I please finish my sentence? You're like Donald Trump. Look, you ask the central election authorities, and there is no way you can hold free and fair elections when 20% of the country is under Russian leadership. You can't do it.
Okay, all right. Where did I go here? Andy Cutchins, my
Thank you.
Center for the National Interest colleague.
Thank you
And Wayne Mary.
to all 4 of you for the stimulating discussion. I have just 2 points I'd like to hear you react to. One is the question of the winnability of the war. On February 24th, 2022, when Putin attacked Ukraine, I thought 2 things immediately. One, he's destroying 2 countries simultaneously. And 2, nobody has the wherewithal to win this war on the terms in which they would define as victory. Now, here we are 2.5 years later, not 2 years later, 2.5 years later, and I don't see a shred of evidence to support the conclusion that this war is winnable. Certainly not winnable on the terms that Russia and Ukraine continue to define as their mission. I don't really care what these retired generals you say. I mean, both of them, Breedlove and Hodges, have been cheerleaders for Ukraine virtually from day one of the war. So there's some bias there. I interact with a lot of generals and admirals. I spent a lot of time playing golf with them, and there's not one that I know that I respect and spend time with that thinks the war is actually winnable. So I think there's really a burden of proof on the part of Melinda and Jacob to clarify why they think the war is winnable. The second point is, and I guess there seems to be sort of an underlying belief, not only here, of course, that if Donald Trump becomes president, he's going to sell Ukraine down the river. Well, I mean, there are a couple of few things I would point out that would first of all, the guy's extremely unpredictable, so leave that, there's that. But if you look at when did deterrence fail in Ukraine, it failed twice. It failed in 2014 when Barack Obama was president, and it failed in 2022 when Joe Biden was president. It did not fail when Donald Trump was president from 2016 to 2020. I think that's an inconvenient fact for the Democratic Party side. Secondly, Donald Trump actually, he was the first president to send to Ukraine lethal military goods. His predecessor had refused to do that. The third thing is, and Melinda, we talked briefly about this before, that there's no way that Mike Johnson made the decision and looked very statesmanlike when he did so to support the $60 billion of funding for Ukraine without the support, likely in a phone call, from Donald Trump, in my view. So, kind of curious as to what do you think, what you actually think a Donald Trump presidency would mean for the war in Ukraine?
I think that's kind of two questions, mainly to you guys. Prove that the war can be won, and what do you think Trump would actually do? Who wants to take?
I'll take the first half, one half of the question, and Melinda can take the hard one. I would say I'll let Melinda do the winning, but I would say right now we are exhausting the Russians, which is good enough for me. And I don't think we can retreat from this. I also don't think that Russia, as Melinda alluded to earlier, has inexhaustible reserves, especially now that oil is going below $70 a barrel. As to Donald Trump, in the first term, that's
an artful dodge, Jacob.
No, she's going to take it. In the first term, Trump was obviously to some extent outmaneuvered by his advisors. I don't think it's going to happen if he comes back to power. He has a Vice President, J.D. Vance, who will probably staff much of the administration. Vance himself has said he's utterly indifferent to the fate of Ukraine. Trump is promising that he will solve the conflict in one day, which he can easily do, simply by, he's talking about cutting off the supply of weapons to Ukraine immediately to force it into negotiations with Mr. Putin. Well, we have a pretty good idea of what that outcome would look like. That's why I have no confidence in Trump's ability to negotiate a remotely satisfactory conclusion to this conflict.
But it's not going to be Trump's decision to negotiate the end of the settlement. The settlement will be negotiated between the Ukrainians and the Russians.
You could say that, but if he cuts off military aid to them, and contrary to Curt, the Europeans, as feckless as they may be, simply do not have the capacity to pursue this without American help. And I don't trust Donald Trump. It's that simple. Melinda can take the other half.
One sentence on javelins. Yes, Trump was the one who gave javelins, but I think it was just to stick an eye in Obama's face. I mean, he did it for political reasons. I don't buy Curt Volker's argument that Trump's statements at the debate were meant to keep the door open for negotiation. I don't buy that. Okay, this is the hard question, Andy. What's victory? And the answer to this question is changing in Ukraine, but the bottom line is real security guarantees. From a Ukrainian perspective, that's what victory is. And they're not going to get NATO now, but the best they're going to get are bilateral security guarantees. And the United States is going to give them a 10-year commitment, and Congress is working on that now.
Well, that's not how the war is winnable.
Well, we're going to need an hour to talk about it. Can they make any progress in the Donbass? What should they do about Kursk? What should they cut off with Crimea? I can't answer that.
You said the war was winnable. You did.
The war is winnable.
The war is winnable.
You
Yes.
said that.
The war is winnable if you give them enough kit
Okay.
and you give them real security guarantees. These things are not on the table right now.
Okay.
Real security guarantees come later.
You have to but you have to answer the security guarantee question. Without that, Russia's going to continue on indefinitely, and the Ukrainians are not going to. The Ukrainians will fight with forks, even if Donald Trump is elected. The Ukrainians have assured me that they will continue to do guerrilla fighting.
Why would the Russians not continue on indefinitely anyway? I see no signs of them.
Oh, that's a separate.
Yeah.
Let's
Let's some others.
Curt and Helen respond.
It's strange that Donald Trump is being used as a byword for abandoning the Ukrainians when, as the questioner pointed out, that's not what he did in his 4 years. I think, Donald Trump is, idiot savant, however you want to interpret it. I think his goal in Ukraine was to have a middle ground, enough that you support them enough to deter Russia, but not enough to antagonize Russia. And clearly, he found that middle ground based on the evidence, because Putin did not invade during Trump's 4 years. Biden then escalated American support for Ukraine, particularly military support for Ukraine, doubled down on bringing them into NATO and all the rest of it. And it was that escalation under Biden that precipitated the invasion. They went too far, went beyond deterrence into encouraging a Russian response. So if a middle ground is what's going to keep us all peaceful and not dead, I trust Donald Trump to find that a little bit more than Biden.
Curt, you want to add anything?
Sure, yeah, just on the points that have been made. I mean, respectfully, we can't take the assurances of what this government is saying to officials in Washington. I'm sure officials in Kabul were giving similar assurances to the Biden administration, the Trump administration, that they would also fight the Taliban on forks if the U.S. left and the thing crumbled in 4 days. I mean, as to the point, I just have to agree with my colleague here. The idea that Trump merely gave Ukrainians javelins despite Obama, I mean, that would be news to Curt Volker, who was at this building 6 years ago explaining in depth, I wrote it up, about why the decision occurred. And additionally, I actually slightly disagree the idea that the war has to be negotiated between the Ukrainians and the Russians, or the Ukrainian government and the Russians. We have another precedent. The U.S. is now a party to this, unfortunately, it shouldn't have been in the first place, but we have a precedent. It's called the Korean War, where the U.S. Created a durable ceasefire, an armistice that coheres to this day, where the government in Seoul was not a party to because they were too ridiculous and too belligerent. And I think that's a reasonable framework to start negotiations should a new president. By the way, I think this would be my advice to Harris as well. I mean, I think the debate performance was not promising on her end for what she was saying about these sort of things, but she also has the opportunity to make this Biden's war and turn the page.
All right, so we have Wayne, Mary, then we have one back here, and then I'll be over to this side.
Yeah. This can be a very long discussion, of course.
Well,
but
actually,
it's
we
not.
have 13
Yes,
minutes.
understood.
So let's
Okay,
keep it brief.
not for me. Okay. Ukraine's been a client state of the United States since the breakup of the Soviet Union. I was part of that in the Pentagon in the mid-90s when we helped rebuild their new military. We did not do that with the object of it becoming a NATO member. My boss, Bill Perry, said publicly, he actually seriously considered resigning in protest against NATO expansion. The idea of what we were trying to do in Ukraine then was to make it a viable, neutral state, to make it essentially an East European Austria with a competent minimal military. What changed was the administration of George W. Bush at Bucharest, where the Bush-Cheney people gave us the third war, which was putting the arm on our NATO allies to commit that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. This was before even a majority of the population of the country and polls expressed an interest in doing so. But we, at Bucharest, got NATO to sign on to a document that said that Ukraine will become a member of NATO, and Vladimir Putin was sitting there as the guest of honor at that NATO summit. That's when things really changed. If anybody has made Ukraine nationalistic, it's Putin, I regret to say. And the United States certainly has not fulfilled what, in my view, is its moral obligation of having played a huge role of getting Ukraine into this mess, of backing it up as getting it through this mess. I don't think victory has anything to do with it, but Ukraine can endure as an independent state if it's given the wherewithal to do so. And I think that fundamentally is the responsibility of the United States.
Thank you. What I'd like to do actually now is, I have 4 more people on the list. I'd like to just take those quickly. And then each of you, maybe like a minute or 90 seconds or something, and we'll just go down the line. So back here in the corner. Yeah.
Very quick question for Ms. Haring. One thing that
And if you could identify.
yeah, my name is Nicholas Bartulovic. The one thing that I was kind of, I've played enough, map-based video games to where like I think about this enough. So I understand the strategic points from like Russia, Ukraine, both sides. But what really kind of strikes me, and this is only an accident of geography that I was born here instead of Ukraine, is your point that, we should be thankful that the young Ukrainian men are going to die and, as you put it, doing our dirty work for us. Seems kind of morally suspect in my opinion. So how do you defend that? And just since we all have to like reveal our personal details, my grandparents came over from Hungary in '56. So I'm no Russophile in asking this question, but it seems kind of, 30 years old, I could easily be sent off if I was Ukrainian to go fight in this war. So I want to know how you square that morally with advocating for other people to fight our wars for us.
All right, then we'll come over here, sir.
Alexander with Senator Marsha Blackburn's office. I'm curious how recent developments with Iran providing those ballistic missiles, does that change the calculus for or against continued support to Ukraine?
Then we have, I think, 2 of my colleagues, Lake Dodson, who's one of our editors at the National Interest. You first, please, Lake.
Hi, I'm Lake Dodson, one of the editors of National Interest. So you all touched upon victory, but more I wanted to focus upon was victory according to who? Is it a victory according to Zelensky, who wants to go back to where Ukraine was in 1991 and be welcomed into NATO? Is it a victory according to Olaf Scholz, who imagines that, is looking towards a less tense European climate and a return towards normalizations with Russia when it comes to energy trade and other such trades? Or is it according to, since the United States puts the most money and equipment towards this war, whoever wins in November?
All right, thank you, Lake. And Jeff Kemp, I think we'll come to you last, please.
All right.
You had a question, Jeff.
Oh, yes. It gets back to this issue of Trump and assuming he wins. And the question I have is, are we talking about day one Trump, where the other day he said on day one he will solve both Ukraine and Gaza picking up the telephone? Or are we talking about a Trump administration that has to feature, I presume, a lot of people who we all know who are extremely hawkish on foreign policy, Cotton, Pompeo, Graham, or is it going to be J.D. Vance? So I don't think you can really tell at this point how Trump will behave until we see who he's going to rely on, if anybody, to deal with these incredible problems. I simply don't believe in the day one phenomenon, but you never know.
Awesome. Got a question right there. Sorry. Yes, please.
I do.
This will be the last.
Daniel Balson with Razom for Ukraine. One question for Mr. Mills and Ms. Andrews. Thank you so much for your presentation. To be fair, not all, but I think a very large part of your argument hinges on the fact that Russia is, of course, a nuclear-armed state, and the risk of blowback and strikes, whether tactical, strategic, nuclear weapons. Other countries are, of course, watching what plays out in Ukraine. So if the U.S. follows your recommendation and cuts and runs from Ukraine, doesn't that simply bid up the value of nuclear weapons and incentivize proliferation? I mean, if you're a foreign government, you see if you are a backwards Middle Eastern country like Iraq and you invade a neighbor, you get the highway of death, and your troops are burned, and an international coalition brings you to heel. And if you are a nuclear-armed country like Russia, you can do as you please, when you please. This seems to be a giant argument in favor of proliferation, including in a world where Iran is currently seeking nuclear weapons.
All right. Let's let each of you respond, I think. Yeah, I think so. We'll just give each of you, it's 1:55, we'll each give you each a minute. Let's just go down the line here.
On the morality question, it's obvious that the Ukrainians themselves are committed to this fight. It's not that the United States is bullying them into it. That's why I think it's perfectly appropriate and, in fact, incumbent upon us to provide them with what they need. And I agree with Wayne Mary that right now winning is enduring. We don't know what's coming. As for Trump, I wish I shared Jeff's optimism or his cautious sobriety about where this could head. Because I think if Trump were elected, we'd go over the waterfall in international relations, both in terms of our alliances in Asia and in Europe.
Melinda.
So on the Iran question, yes, I think it's a game changer. You saw Foreign Secretary Lamy yesterday mention that both the United States and London see these ballistic missiles as Russia escalating. So I think that's changed the calculus, and I think that the White House and the British government are going to revise the limitations that they've put on these long-range missiles. And the question on victory, that one's a hard one. We need probably another session to discuss victory. It depends is the easy answer. I can tell you, though, from conversations in Ukraine, that the way that Ukrainians are answering what is victory is changing based on how hard, to my friend Michael's point, it's very hard, and Ukrainians want to go home, and they're sick of fighting, and more people feel that way, but that doesn't mean that they're willing to just give away the Donbass. So it's a pretty complicated answer.
Curt. Yep, I see Iran has been invoked by a couple of guests. I presumably scared the bejesus out of conservatives. If indeed that should be a goal of U.S. foreign policy, then I would submit that our course the last 2.5 years has just brought Iran and Russia closer to each other. If our goal is to erode the alleged axis of autocracies, then we should change course. As to the nuclear issue, yes, fair enough. I don't think it's a major part of our argument, though, because my answer would be the exact same if Russia did not have nukes, as it was on the Afghanistan example I cited. And as to the reality of the world that we would create by a withdrawal or a negotiated settlement, I think we should use our political capital and might on negotiations, not all of our political capital on these wars. And then again, I just have to ask, if you go with this side of the house versus if you go with us, if you had listened to us 2.5 years ago, how could it have been worse? And finally, I submit that we win on a technicality because our opponents don't agree on what they're actually putting forward here. They don't agree on a definition of victory. They submit that we have to have another debate. We're good with this one.
Yeah, I agree with my colleague on Mr. Balson's question. It's not that nukes are a desirable weapon because we accord special deference to nuclear powers. We accord special deference to nuclear powers because nuclear weapons are really powerful weapons. That's the way the logic runs, not the other way. And yeah, I on a note of comedy at the end, I agree with Jacob that America has to be part of any negotiated peace here. Although I almost can't believe that Jacob admitted that, we owe it to the Ukrainians to give them the support because we kind of got them into this. They were ready to make peace, 6 months into the war, and then we sent Boris Johnson to go there and scuttle it. And it would be kind of dishonorable for us to prevent Ukraine from reaching a negotiated peace and then not give them what they need to win. Yeah, I agree. That's a terrible thing to do, and we should not have done it. And we shouldn't do it now.
All right. Let's call it there. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. I think a very lively exchange. I'm not sure that we got close to any common ground there, but I think we did highlight in a very sharp way these two contrasting perspectives. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and I hope we see you all again soon.